In the winter of 1931, the city of Liverpool moved at its usual pace. Trams rattled the long, narrow streets, factory whistles marked the hours, and rows of brick terraces stood quietly beneath a gray January sky. Among them was a modest house at 29 Wolverton Street in the Anfield district, home to Julia Wallace and her husband, William Herbert Wallace. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about the house or the couple who lived inside it, and nothing to suggest that this address would soon become associated with one of Britain's most debated murder cases. Julia Wallace was 59 years old. She had been born Julia Dennis and spent much of her life in Liverpool. Those who knew her described her as quiet, private, and orderly. She kept the house clean, attended to her routines, and rarely drew attention to herself. She had no children and lived a largely domestic life. Her world revolved around her home and her husband, and she was not known to entertain visitors or keep close friendships outside a small circle of acquaintances. William Wallace was 10 years her junior. He worked as an insurance agent, collecting premiums from customers across the city, a job that required persistence, careful record-keeping, and regular travel by foot and tram. He was also known among a small group of local men as a keen chess player. Wallace was intelligent but socially awkward, often described as reserved and formal in his manner. He and Julia had been married for over a decade, and while their relationship appeared emotionally distant, there were no reports of open conflict or domestic trouble. On the afternoon of Tuesday, January 20th, 1931, William Wallace followed his usual routine. After completing his work for the day, he went to the City Cafe Chess Club, a small meeting place where he and others gathered to play chess and discuss games. It was here, at approximately 7 p.m., that an unusual event occurred. A message was handed to Wallace by another club member. The message stated that a man calling himself Qualtrough had telephoned earlier and requested to meet Wallace that evening at a cafe in the Menlove Gardens area regarding an insurance matter. The message was written down at the time, not reconstructed later. The name Qualtrough meant nothing to Wallace, but unexpected inquiries were not unusual in his line of work. He agreed to keep the appointment. After leaving the chess club, Wallace returned home briefly and then set out again at around 6:45 p.m., telling Julia that he had business to attend to. She was alive when he left. That fact has never been disputed. Wallace traveled by tram and on foot to Menlove Gardens, searching for the cafe named in the message. He asked shopkeepers and passers-by for directions, but no one recognized the location. After some time, it became clear that the cafe did not exist. Confused, but not alarmed, Wallace concluded that the appointment had been a mistake or a hoax. He then made his way back toward home. Arriving shortly before 9:17 Wolverton Street, 29 Wolverton Street, he found the front door locked as usual. There was nothing immediately unusual about the house. He entered, switched on the gas lighting, and called out to his wife. Receiving no response, he moved into the sitting room. There, he made a discovery that would change his life and unsettle the public for decades to come. Julia Wallace lay on the floor near the fireplace. She had suffered multiple blows to the head from a blunt object. Blood was visible around her head and on the floor. She was already dead. The room showed no clear signs of forced entry or violent struggle beyond the fatal attack itself. Furniture was largely undisturbed. The scene was quiet and contained, not chaotic. Wallace immediately left the house and ran into the street, calling for help. Neighbors responded, and the police were contacted. Officers arrived quickly and secured the property. A preliminary examination suggested that Julia had been killed during the period when Wallace claimed to have been away from the house. No murder weapon was found at the scene. A small amount of money was missing, but the house did not appear to have been thoroughly searched. As news of the crime spread, the details drew increasing attention. The locked doors, the absence of forced entry, and the mysterious telephone message raised difficult questions. If an intruder had entered the house, how had they done so without leaving evidence? If nothing had been broken or disturbed, had Julia known her attacker? And if so, why had that person never been identified? From the beginning, William Wallace's calm demeanor attracted notice. He cooperated fully with the police and answered questions in detail. Some officers found his behavior unusual. interpreting his composure as detachment. Others believed it reflected shock or his naturally reserved personality. No witnesses placed him near the house at the time of the murder. At the same time, the police found no convincing evidence pointing to any other suspect. By the end of the first night, investigators were already facing a troubling reality. The crime scene offered few clues, the timeline was uncertain, and the key event that had drawn Wallace away from his home, the telephone call, remained unexplained. The name Qualtrough could not be traced, and the public telephone box from which the call had been made provided no answers. As dawn broke over Liverpool on January 21st, the house on Overturned Street stood silent under police guard. Inside, Julia Wallace lay where she had been killed. Outside, questions gathered quickly. Was this the work of a stranger who vanished without trace, or was the truth far closer to home? The investigation had only just begun, but already the case was shaping itself into something deeply unsettling. The death of Julia Wallace would soon move from a quiet street in Anfield to courtrooms, newspapers, and public debate. But at this early stage, all that was known for certain was that a woman had been killed inside her locked home, and that the explanation, whatever it might be, would prove far from simple. By the morning of January 21st, 1931, the quiet street of Overturned Street had become a place of careful movement and subdued conversation. Police officers stood outside number 29, while neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, exchanging fragments of information and speculation. Inside the house, investigators began the slow, methodical work of documenting the scene in detail. The parlor where Julia Wallace had been found showed little evidence of a struggle beyond the fatal injuries themselves. Furniture remained in place, ornaments were undisturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry through the doors or windows. The back door was bolted from the inside. Windows were intact. The gas fire had been used earlier that evening, and the room showed signs of ordinary domestic life interrupted abruptly. A wash basin upstairs contained traces of diluted blood, and a towel nearby appeared to have been used for cleaning hands. This suggested that whoever had committed the crime had time and presence of mind to wash before leaving. Yet the means of exit remained unclear. If the killer had entered and left through the front door, they had somehow locked it behind them without leaving evidence. The possibility that the killer had already been inside the house could not be dismissed. Medical examination placed Julia Wallace's death sometime between early evening and late night. The exact time could not be determined with precision. The injuries indicated repeated blows to the head delivered by a heavy blunt object, possibly an iron bar or fireplace tool. No such object was found at the scene. Investigators concluded that the weapon had likely been taken away. The missing items from the house were limited. A small cash box that normally contained a modest sum was lighter than expected, though not entirely empty. No jewelry of value was taken. Nothing suggested a thorough search for valuables. This raised doubts about robbery as a primary motive. Attention soon turned to the mysterious telephone call that had drawn William Wallace away from his home. Detectives returned to the City Cafe Chess Club to interview those who had been present. The message had been received by another member of the club earlier that evening and written down at the time. Several witnesses confirmed its existence. The name Qualtrough had been unfamiliar to everyone. Police traced the call to a public telephone box located near the chess club. It appeared to have been made shortly before Wallace received the message. No one could identify the caller. There were no surveillance systems, no call logs, and no witnesses who remembered seeing anyone suspicious using the box. The call existed, but the person behind it remained unknown. The nature of the message troubled investigators. The caller had not contacted Wallace directly at home, but instead left instructions at a place where Wallace was known to spend time. The appointment was set for a location that did not exist, ensuring Wallace would be delayed in searching. Whoever made the call appeared to know Wallace's habits and schedule. As these details emerged, police began to examine William Wallace's behavior more closely. He provided a detailed account of his movements that evening. Tram conductors confirmed seeing him. Shopkeepers recalled him asking for directions. The timeline of his journey was largely consistent. At the same time, detectives questioned whether the journey could have been staged to create an alibi. Wallace's manner during questioning became a subject of quiet debate. He spoke calmly, sometimes correcting officers on minor details. He did not display outward signs of panic or distress in the way some expected. To certain investigators, this suggested emotional detachment. To others, it reflected his reserved personality and the shock of sudden loss. Police also examined the Wallaces' marriage. Friends and acquaintances described it as distant but stable. There were no reports of violence, financial strain, or jealousy. Wallace did not stand to gain significantly from his wife's death. There were no large insurance policies or inheritance issues. Still, the absence of motive did not remove suspicion. The locked house problem loomed over the investigation. If Wallace was not the killer, then someone else had entered the house, committed the murder, washed up, locked the door, and left without trace. No neighbors reported seeing anyone enter or leave during the relevant time. The street was quiet but not deserted. As days passed, pressure mounted on the police to produce answers. Newspapers seized on the strangeness of the case. Headlines emphasized the locked doors, the vanishing caller, and the unanswered questions. Public opinion began to divide. Some believed Wallace was an unfortunate man trapped by circumstance. Others suspected that the very neatness of his alibi concealed something darker. On January 26th, less than a week after the murder, police formally arrested William Wallace and charged him with the murder of his wife. The decision was based not on direct evidence, but on elimination. With no credible alternative suspect and no clear explanation for how an intruder could have committed the crime, investigators concluded that Wallace himself must have been responsible. Wallace was taken into custody calmly. He denied any involvement and maintained his account without contradiction. His arrest intensified public interest. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Editorials debated whether the police had acted decisively or prematurely. Behind the scenes, legal preparations began. The prosecution faced a difficult task: to prove guilt without a weapon, without witnesses to the act, and without a clear motive. The defense would rely on the strength of Wallace's alibi and the uncertainty surrounding the crime scene. As the case moved toward trial, one fact remained unchanged. Julia Wallace had been killed inside her locked home, and no explanation fully satisfied the evidence. The investigation had narrowed rather than clarified the possibilities. What began as a domestic tragedy was now becoming a test of logic, inference, and the limits of proof. The question confronting the court would not be whether the crime was terrible, but whether it could be proven beyond reasonable doubt who had committed it. And in that space between certainty and suspicion, the fate of William Wallace would be decided. The trial of William Herbert Wallace opened in April 1931 at the Liverpool Assizes and immediately drew widespread public attention. Courtrooms filled each day with spectators, journalists, and legal observers aware that the case presented an unusual challenge. There were no eyewitnesses to the crime, no recovered weapon, and no confession. The case rested instead on inference, timing, and the interpretation of circumstance. The prosecution began by outlining its central argument. Julia Wallace, they said, had been killed during the precise window in which her husband claimed to be absent. The house had been locked, showing no signs of forced entry. From this, the prosecution argued that no stranger could reasonably have entered and left the premises unnoticed. The only person with unquestioned access to the house, they asserted, was William Wallace himself. They proposed that Wallace had murdered his wife shortly before leaving the house, secured the doors, and then embarked on a carefully constructed journey designed to create an alibi. The mysterious telephone call, according to this theory, had been arranged by Wallace himself. By ensuring that witnesses saw him searching for a non-existent cafe, he could demonstrate apparent innocence while concealing the crime. To support this argument, the prosecution emphasized Wallace's detailed knowledge of the house and his calm demeanor following the discovery of the body. They suggested that his behavior was inconsistent with that of a grieving husband, and more consistent with someone who knew what had happened. They also pointed to the absence of valuables taken from the house, arguing that the limited missing items could have been staged to suggest robbery. The defense responded by challenging the foundation of the prosecution's case. Wallace's legal team emphasized that his movements on the evening of the murder were independently confirmed by multiple witnesses across different locations. These witnesses were not acquaintances or allies, but ordinary members of the public who had no reason to fabricate their accounts. Tram conductors confirmed his presence. Shopkeepers recalled his questions. The timeline, they argued, left little opportunity for him to commit the murder and still appear where he was seen. The defense also addressed the telephone call. It had been received and written down by others at the chess club, not by Wallace himself. Several witnesses confirmed hearing of the call at the time. For Wallace to have fabricated it, the defense argued, he would have had to predict its later importance and involve others without their knowledge. The absence of evidence identifying the caller did not prove Wallace's involvement. Medical testimony became a focal point. Experts could not determine an exact time of death. Estimates varied, and the margin of uncertainty was significant. The defense argued that Julia Wallace could have been killed later than the prosecution suggested, during a period when Wallace was demonstrably elsewhere. Without precise timing, they contended, the prosecution's theory remained speculative. The locked house question proved more difficult. The defense acknowledged that it posed a troubling mystery, but argued that unexplained circumstances were not proof of guilt. It was possible, they said, that someone known to Julia had been admitted voluntarily. It was also possible that the locking mechanism could be manipulated in ways not fully understood. The absence of a clear explanation did not justify assuming Wallace's guilt. As the trial progressed, the courtroom atmosphere remained tense. Jurors listened closely as both sides revisited the same facts from opposing angles. Each argument seemed to raise further questions rather than resolve them. The prosecution asked the jury to rely on logic and elimination. The defense urged them to rely on evidence and doubt. Public opinion outside the courtroom remained sharply divided. Newspapers published daily summaries and commentary. Some editorials argued that Wallace's guilt was the only reasonable explanation. Others warned against convicting a man on circumstantial reasoning alone. The case became a subject of discussion in homes, workplaces, and public houses across the country. After several days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Their decision would determine not only Wallace's fate, but also how the law would weigh probability against proof. When they returned, the verdict was guilty. William Wallace was sentenced to death. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of silence and subdued response. Wallace himself showed little outward emotion. He maintained his innocence and prepared to appeal. The case then moved to the Court of Criminal Appeal. Wallace's legal team argued that the conviction was unsafe, relying too heavily on inference and insufficiently on concrete evidence. They emphasized the lack of a murder weapon, the absence of a clear motive, and the strength of Wallace's alibi. In a decision that surprised many, the appellate court overturned the conviction. The judges ruled that the evidence was insufficient to support a verdict of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Wallace was released. No retrial was ordered. The legal process had concluded, but the questions surrounding Julia Wallace's death remained unresolved. The court had determined that Wallace could not be lawfully convicted, but it had not established what truly happened inside the house on Wolverton Street. With Wallace free and no alternative suspect identified, the case entered a state of uncertainty. Justice had intervened, but clarity had not followed. The final chapter of the story would not be written in a courtroom, but in public memory, debate, and the lingering unease left by a crime without resolution. William Herbert Wallace walked free from prison in May 1931, a man legally cleared yet permanently marked. The Court of Criminal Appeal's decision had overturned his conviction on the grounds that the evidence was insufficient to sustain a verdict of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The ruling did not declare him innocent. It declared only that the case against him was unsafe. That distinction would define the remainder of Wallace's life. Public reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Some newspapers praised the appeal court for correcting what they viewed as a dangerous precedent, a conviction based almost entirely on circumstantial reasoning. Others condemned the decision, arguing that justice had failed a murdered woman whose killer had now escaped punishment. Editorials debated whether the law had protected an innocent man or released a guilty one through technicality. Wallace returned briefly to Overturned Street, though the house was no longer his home in any meaningful sense. Julia Wallace was buried, her life reduced in public memory to the circumstances of her death. The house itself became a symbol of unanswered questions. Neighbors avoided discussing the case openly, yet its presence lingered. The quiet street where nothing had seemed amiss now carried a reputation it could not shed. Wallace himself withdrew from public view. He attempted to resume work but found opportunities limited. His name was widely known, and employers hesitated. Though no longer a convicted man, he remained under suspicion in the court of public opinion. Friends were few. Acquaintances became distant. He lived quietly, with little sign of anger or bitterness, but also without visible reintegration into normal life. 2 years after his release, in 1933, William Wallace died at the age of 52. His death passed with little notice. There were no renewed investigations, no posthumous declarations. He took whatever knowledge he possessed to the grave, whether that knowledge consisted of guilt, innocence, or nothing at all. The police investigation into Julia Wallace's murder was never reopened. No new suspects were charged. The mysterious telephone caller known as Qualtrough was never identified. No weapon was recovered. The missing items from the house were never traced. The case file closed without resolution. Over time, the murder of Julia Wallace came to occupy a unique place in British legal history. Law students studied it as an example of the limits of circumstantial evidence. Legal scholars cited it when discussing the dangers of reasoning by elimination rather than proof. Detectives revisited it in discussions about locked-room crimes and the assumptions they invite. Alternative theories emerged and persisted. Some suggested that Julia Wallace may have admitted a visitor she trusted, someone from her past who vanished after the crime. Others proposed that the killer entered and exited in a manner investigators failed to consider, exploiting assumptions about the house's security. A minority continued to argue that Wallace himself had committed the murder, believing the appeal court had erred in prioritizing legal caution over moral certainty. None of these theories could be proven. Each relied on speculation, inference, or gaps in the record. The evidence, such as it was, remained unchanged. The same locked doors, the same unexplained call, the same uncertain timeline continued to frustrate attempts at clarity. What made the case endure was not only its mystery, but its restraint. There were no dramatic chases, no confessions, no final revelations. The crime unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, and ended in ambiguity. It forced observers to confront uncomfortable truths about certainty and doubt, about how much the law can reasonably claim to know. Julia Wallace herself faded into the background of these debates. Her life before the murder was rarely discussed. She became defined by how she died rather than how she lived. In that sense, the case reflected broader attitudes of the time, in which victims were often overshadowed by legal argument and public fascination with the accused. Nearly a century later, the house on Overturned Street still stands. The street is no longer the Liverpool of 1931. Trams are gone. The city has changed. But the case remains fixed in the historical record, unchanged by time. The murder of Julia Wallace endures because it offers no certainty. It resists closure. It stands as a reminder that not every crime yields to explanation, and that legal outcomes do not always align with human expectation. Whether William Wallace was an innocent man caught in circumstance or a guilty man who benefited from doubt remains unknown. What is certain is that on a winter evening in Liverpool, a woman was killed inside her home, and the truth of what happened there was never fully uncovered. The case closed in law, but not in memory, and in that unresolved space, the story continues to provoke quiet unease, long after the courtroom doors have closed.